So good afternoon, guys. So moving on from yesterday's lecture, today we're going to talk about stratigraphy, which is an important concept in geology and is kind of an underlying concept of how geologists interpret the rock record and how we understand rock sequences and build these together to eventually, come to look at the geology of South Africa. So we've got two things to do today, and they are related to each other. So we're going to look at stratigraphy in general and the basic concepts, which are defined by a series of laws, known as Steno's laws. So we're going to have a look at these. And then we're going to look at different types of stratigraphy. So lithostratigraphy, chemostratigraphy, and biostratigraphy. Just very briefly, kind of just to get an overview so you get a little bit familiar with these concepts. And then we're going to look at one of the other things I said, a big thing we're going to do is how we date rocks, so various dating methods. And then we have two dating methods we use in geology. One is relative dating and one is absolute dating. So absolute dating, we use various techniques to actually date various clocks, kind of locked in the rocks. But today we're going to look at relative dating, and the major system the major technique we use is stratigraphy. So it kind of follows on after finding out what stratigraphy is, that its major application is relative dating, which is working out how old rocks are relative to each other. And another way that we can do relative dating is by using paleontology, the fossils that are preserved in the rocks. So these concepts all kind of feed into each other and are all related. So stratigraphy is one of the major underlying concepts of geology. And a definition of this is that it's a branch of geology concerned with the order and relative position of strata. So the order is just literally from the bottom to the top. What order do we see the rocks in? And the relative position is kind of both in time and in space, where we find these on the landscape, how different rock layers and different units relate to each other. And then, so we're looking at the order and relative position of strata or layers of rock and their relationship to the geological timescale that we talked about yesterday. So basically, when geologists arrive at an outcrop and begin to assess the rocks, we start at the bottom and work our way to the top and work out, what we're seeing where, and then we need to work out how old they are and how we can relate that to what we know about the geological timescale. So stratigraphy is important in understanding the temporal relationships in sedimentary rock bodies. So it's a big thing in sedimentology where we have nice horizontal strata of rock, what's older, what's younger, what formed when. And the history of past geological events. So this is obviously a big thing in geology, working out what happened, how did these rocks form. And as I said, this understanding of stratigraphy underpins the relative dating of rocks. So stratigraphy is by no means a new concept. And this handsome man, Nicholas Steno, who was a Danish scientist who lived in the 1600s, and he was a Renaissance man, and he was kind of interested in very many things, but what he was particularly fascinated in were a series of shark teeth fossils that he found in some pretty ancient rocks. And he noticed that these they were called glossopteri, which just means tongue stones, and people didn't know what they were. And he realized that these tongue stones were actually fossil shark teeth and were very similar to modern shark teeth. So this got him thinking that perhaps there was some kind of uniformitarianism, that these prehistoric sharks, which he found the fossils of, were actually very similar to modern animals, and that there was some depth of time going on here. So 2 years later, he came up with 4 defining laws of stratigraphy, and these still underpin how we understand stratigraphy today. So the 4 laws up here, we have the law of superposition, the law of original horizontality, the principle of lateral continuity, and the principle of cross-cutting relationships. So we're going to look at each one of these separately and go through some examples. Yeah. Yes.
They're also the same as the shark that we have today. So how did he get that bend or different, like from the teeth? How do you can get this? How it looks like?
Yeah, it's not a kind of a simple leap. I guess what he realized is that people didn't actually know that the fossil teeth They didn't really realize that they were fossils, and they certainly didn't realize that they were shark teeth. They called them glossopteri, which was tongue stones. People basically had no idea what they were. And he realized, he kind of clicked that they were fossil shark teeth, and that they were fossils even. So, yeah, he couldn't reconstruct what the shark looked like, but he realized that they were fossils and that they were similar to modern sharks, so that in the past they were ancient sharks. Yeah?
Evidence is that the ancient shark was different from the
Yeah. You would need a lot more fossils. You would need a body fossil of a shark to see that it was different. And with the shark example, we know that sharks have hardly changed at all. Their basic architecture is pretty much the same over millions of years. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. All right, so the first law is the principle of superposition. So what this means is that sedimentary layers become progressively younger through a stratigraphic sequence. So this should be quite intuitive. It kind of makes sense that the oldest material is at the bottom, and it's like a cake, a layer cake. And as these layers build up, we start with the oldest at the bottom, getting younger, younger, younger. So that's basically this first principle of stratigraphy. And this is a photograph of the beautiful Fish River Canyon in Namibia. And although the light's not great here, but you can see we've got all these various different layers of sedimentary rocks. And if you visited the Fish River Canyon and you wanted to find the oldest rocks, you would start at the bottom of this valley and work your way through these beautiful layers of sediments, starting with the oldest at the bottom. So the second principle is the principle of original horizontality. So this concept is that layered strata of rocks were deposited horizontally or nearly horizontally, or basically parallel to the Earth's surface. So the idea is that in a sedimentary basin where you're getting, or the ocean where you're getting sediment washed in, that these layers are forming parallel to the Earth's surface, which is basically horizontal. And this is another example. This is a photograph from near Harrismith in the Free State. And you can see you've got these beautiful sandstone strata, and they are parallel to the surface of the Earth. So this concept is that rocks are originally deposited parallel. And this becomes useful when things get changed and you get another process coming in later. So this is just a kind of textbook example where you have, at the time of deposition, you have these different layers of rock shown in the different colors, and they are nice and horizontal and parallel to each other, and that's how they've been deposited, starting with the oldest at the bottom. And then you've had some external forces, maybe a continental collision, and these sediments have been squeezed, and which has resulted in them folding. So in cross-section, you can see they've been folded, and the surface expression, you get various different folds. So the strata's been deformed. And what this principle says is that if we go in the field today and we see rocks that look like this, we know that something's happened to them, that they were originally horizontal and then they've been deformed. So we can begin to reconstruct what's happened to these rocks and the various processes that have acted out through time. And this is particularly relevant where we're looking at folding and faulting. And this is a real-life example. This is a photograph of some rocks from the Swiss Alps. And you can see over here you've got the strata are still horizontal and parallel more or less with the Earth's surface. And then if we look over here, you can see these amazing folds where the rocks have been completely folded and overturned. And this is from the African continent colliding with the European continent, which this continent-continent collision has basically built the Alps and deformed these rocks and pushed them up. And so by recognizing these field structures where you can see the folding and deformation, we know these rocks didn't form originally like this, that we can reconstruct this process that's caused the deformation. So the third principle, the one of lateral continuity, is that's the only one that hasn't really survived kind of the test of time. And we're not going to really dwell on that. Instead, I'm going to jump forward into the fourth principle, which is of cross-cutting relationships. And this should be a little bit familiar. Trish told me she had told you guys about this. So this is where a rock body is cut or crossed by another rock body or a structure or an unconformity. And the original rock body is older than whatever is cutting across it. So this is just a picture where we've got some strata here, and then they've been cross-cut by this red, which could be a vein or a dike. And we can, by looking at this, we can work out that this is the youngest feature. So this would be the oldest here, and you've got your layers getting younger and younger, and then they've all been cut through by that. So you can work out a relative timing of what's happening with these different rock bodies, and the youngest is always the one that cross-cuts through everything. And here's just another example where you've got some sediments and then a younger volcanic dike that's cutting through everything. So this is particularly useful in the field of kind of reconstructing what happened when. And we'll come back and look at this. Yes? Yes, and it's representing, say, a quartz vein or a dike or some kind of rock that's come through and cut through everything. Yes. Yes. So it's something's happened. Perhaps what's most likely happened is that there's been a fault, so that's created a crack, and you've got a new rock that's come, some sort of liquid or lava that's come and filled that crack. So we're looking at a whole other process that's acted. And basically, as geologists, we just have the snapshot that we see today, and we have to kind of interpret what's been going on. So as engineers, this is important because this is a plane of weakness where the rocks have cracked, and they will continue to crack along that plane, and most likely, parallel and orientated to that will be a stress field. So this is something to look out for, would be cross-cutting relationships. And you can also work out what's older and what's younger. So that in a nutshell is the kind of concept of stratigraphy, that we have layers of rock and we can work out the kind of history that's preserved in them. But we get different types of stratigraphy. And what we do as geologists is create stratigraphic columns. So in the field, we'll go and assess an outcrop of rocks. And we start, if we've got, say, a road cutting, and we start at the bottom and measure the cutting and then log and have a look at the different rocks that we see. And we draw them up in something called a stratigraphic column, where you literally have your different rock types. So maybe you have a granite at the bottom, then you have some nice sediments, and then maybe a mudstone or something. And so this is a stratigraphic column. And then the various different types of stratigraphy that we can use is then how we classify these rocks that we see, and various analysis that we can do to come up with different ways of assessing them. So the one thing that we can do, and the one type of plot that we can make, is called lithostratigraphy. So litho is Latin for rock. So lithostratigraphy means that we divide our profile up based on the rock types that we see, which kind of sounds intuitive, and it's the basic form of stratigraphy, that you divide your rocks up based on the rock type. But then we have a couple of other options. One is biostratigraphy, so bio means life, where we divide our rocks up by the fossils that we find preserved in them. So we've got different types of fossils preserved in here, and we can use that, say we've got all the same fossils in here, but we would classify these together. We'll go into this in more detail. We have some examples. And then chemostratigraphy, where we use geochemistry. So we measure the various chemical variation in the rocks. So we'll look at something like, say, the strontium concentrations or strontium isotopes even, and we'll see that how these change through time. And we'll measure the strontium all the way up and join the dots together. And we're able to reconstruct the past conditions recorded in the stack of rocks from the geochemistry, the chemical analysis that's locked in these various layers. And then the last type of stratigraphy is called magnetostratigraphy, and this is where, as rocks form, they preserve the magnetic field of the Earth. And the magnetic field of the Earth today, the North Pole, the geographical North Pole and the magnetic North Pole are both pointing to the north. But at times in the past, this entire magnetic field has flipped over, and the magnetic North Pole has been where the geographical South Pole is. And rocks record this change in the Earth's magnetic field. And we can also use this to divide rocks up by measuring the paleomagnetic signal in them. So these are just the 4 different types of stratigraphy. So to look in a bit more detail, this is to look at lithostratigraphy. So as I said, this is a rock stratigraphy, and this is where a body of rocks is defined and recognized on the basis of its lithological properties. So you would be looking for various observable features in the rocks, things like the physical features. So the composition, is it composed of sand or mud or gravel, the color of the sediments, and various sedimentary structures. So this is that example from Harrismith again, where we have various different sandstones, and they're capped off by a dolomite, so or a dolerite rather. So if you went and you could go and look for differences between these various sedimentary units and classify them. Is it a sandstone? Is it a mudstone? And using these physical characteristics, you can classify your rocks and build that together to form a stratigraphic column that's based on the lithostratigraphy, the rock stratigraphy. And this is the fundamental way that rocks are classified in geology. And so we have a hierarchy of using lithostratigraphic units. So when we're in the field, we look for the smallest unit of rocks that's defined as called a bed, and that will be, say, a single sandstone layer. And where you recognize various different units, these get grouped together to form a member. And those then in turn get grouped together to various different members get grouped to make a formation, which would be a kind of larger collection of rocks. And then those again get grouped together to form something called a group. So that would be like the Table Mountain sandstone is a group of rocks. And then the various different groups of rocks, eventually you get a supergroup. So I realize this is all a bit dry. And there's just some definitions for you. So when we look at geological maps, what we see on the maps are geological formations, because these are fundamental units that are large enough to be mapped. So when we're looking at the geology of South Africa at a geological map, you guys aren't going to be seeing this kind of smaller detail. That's what you see in the field, and this is from above that. That's what you'll see on a map. So this is just an example of using chemostratigraphy to understand a stratigraphic column of rocks. So this is an example where we have the geological timescale here, and this is an excerpt from the timescale that we were looking at yesterday, where the different colors, and we've got the age here, the various stages, and that's basically just kind of cut out of that geological timescale. And then here's the lithostratigraphy. This is the lithostratigraphic log from this outcrop of rocks, where we have the various different rock formations. And you can see there's a lot of detail. And then to understand what we're seeing in these rocks and the variation that they're recording, the people in this study measured the oxygen isotopes, the carbon isotopes. They looked at magnesium. They looked at titanium and aluminium ratios, silica ratios, magnesium-calcium ratios, and chromium-aluminium, as well as some strontium. So they measured a whole range of elements, and that's by taking small samples through all of these rocks and measuring them in the lab. And then they've plotted up all the results so that they're spatially related. So each one of these points relates back to the rock that it was measured from. And you can see that you end up with a profile of how these various elements and ratios vary in the stack of rocks. And it becomes quite interesting because you can look for trends and shifts in the data. So they've picked out this area here where lots of the values are trending towards higher values. So there must be something going on here. There's more mudstone. So there was some change in the depositional environment. What it actually was isn't that important right now. But this is a very good way of understanding changes in the, what was happening and understanding the, what these rocks are telling us by measuring the chemistry within the sequence. Example is biostratigraphy, and this is using faunal or biological succession. So this is relying on the fossils that are preserved in sedimentary rocks and how these fossils change during time, over time. So everywhere on Earth, fossils are found in a consistent and predictable succession. So the logic is, so one example is the evolution of the horse. So if we look, these are the various fossil remains. That's the foot and the tooth from an ancient horse, was this sweet little thing. And over several millions of years, we have a predictable, well, a sequence which we understand very well of how the horse has evolved based on the fossils that we found, which ends up with a modern horse. So we know this very well, and it's been defined. So if we find a rock, and we don't know how old it is, and it has horse fossils that are like these ones, then we can work out how old it is relative to how we understand horse fossils, for example. And there's various other fossils which are particularly useful. So one example are these snail shells, which are called ammonites. I think I have another slide about those. Oh, yeah, we will come back to that. So kind of leading on from the biostratigraphy, one of the major uses of biostratigraphy is geological dating. So this is actually my field of specialty. So I get asked this a lot, dating rocks, taking them for romantic dinners and long walks on the beach. So we're going to do the rest of today's lecture talking about relative dating, and then next week we're going to do absolute dating. So the relative dating, what underpins this geological method are Steno's laws, which we've talked about. We can use paleontology, like the example I just gave you, and we're going to look at a couple of examples. And the cross-cutting relationships is a very powerful tool. Then using absolute dating is a kind of a different headspace, and we can use various methods, things like carbon dating, which helps us to absolutely date the rocks. So we're going to talk about that next week. So here's our friend Nicholas Steno again, just to remind you, as his 4 defining laws of stratigraphy. And the 2 most useful laws in terms of working out the relative age of rocks is the law of superposition and the principle of cross-cutting relationships. So these are just an example of working out the relative age of a series of rocks. So we've got a diagram here where we have kind of a 3D reconstruction of a geological basin, and you've got underlying strata, which is all at an angle, and then on top of that are some new sediments which are accumulating in this basin. So you've got some mountains up there and rivers draining down, and these rivers will be washing sand and mud and gravel into this basin and forming these new layers on the bottom of the ocean. But underneath them, we can see even older geological layers which have been tilted up. So we know they would have originally formed horizontally, but they've been deformed and tilted and then eroded. And so when we're looking at these sediments accumulating in the ocean, we know that the youngest is at the bottom, and that the oldest, and they're going to be getting younger and younger as we go through. So here's just an example of a real rock sequence where we know we've got the oldest at the bottom, and they'll be going younger as we work our way through. And so just by using this principle, we can work out what's older and what's younger in a given sequence of rocks. And I guess the key thing is that if they are undisturbed, and that's what we've been saying, if there's been folding or faulting, and particularly folding can completely overturn a sequence. Yes? Yes. So finding beautiful sequences of undisturbed sedimentary rocks is quite rare in the end. And because we have a dynamic Earth, and we have plate tectonics and continents moving, and huge mountain ranges like the Himalayas, the Cape Fold Belt, most rocks are deformed. And you do get examples where they're completely overturned, and we'll look at some later. So it's actually quite rare, and maybe this is why geologists get so excited. It's like the Grand Canyon and the Fish River Canyon, where you have this beautiful example of undisturbed strata. It's actually quite rare. So I guess this principle you have to be aware that it's only if they're undisturbed. And two important terms to bear in mind when you're looking at a stratified sequence is that you don't always just get perfect deposition, which is continuous, and you just get layers building up. We can get something called an unconformity. So this is a surface of erosion. So this is where the deposition, say the rivers washing sediment into the basin, for whatever reason have stopped, and you get a period with so you get various breaks in deposition. So say a disconformity would be a break in deposition. So say you've got a sedimentary basin and the rivers stop washing material in, and so nothing happens. And then a period of time passes and the rivers will start again, and you get sedimentation continuing. So you actually have something called a disconformity. You have a break in time, which is, so you've got sediments accumulating and then this break, and that's normally marked somehow. Sometimes we can actually see where it's dried out, or the sediments that continue are different. So we can see these, and when there's no erosion, it's called a disconformity. So that would say happen in a sedimentary basin where it's all underwater. But an unconformity will be where we've had a break in deposition and the surface has actually dried out and been eroded, and then new sediments have been accumulated. So I've got some illustrations to show you what I mean by that. So these are just two terms to bear in mind. So the other major way that we do relative dating of rocks is this concept, which is not unfamiliar, by using the cross-cutting relationships. So that if we have the older sediments are cut by a younger intrusive layer. So as we've already talked about, these are just some more photographs showing you we have some sedimentary layers that have then been cut through by a younger material. So those two things, this principle of superposition that we have, we're just kind of going through time with layers building up. And then the other major way we can tell that something, the youngest part, is something that's cutting through all of those. And then the other thing that we touched on was that using paleontology, so doing biostratigraphy as a relative way of working out how old rocks are. And we've kind of covered this, but just using the fossil evidence in the rocks to look at how old they are. So I think the most useful thing is to look at an example. So these are just some kind of textbook examples of using a group of fossil animals that are diagnostic to a specific time period and a group of rocks. So here we have a sequence where we've got various different rock layers, and in these, say in this package of rocks, we have this collection of fossils. We've got this ammonite snail, we've got this type of fossil plant, and these other bivalves. So we've got this collection of fossil animals which are really characteristic of this layer of rocks. And then as we move up in the sequence, the layer above, we have slightly different suite of fossils. We don't have fossil plants, there's a fossil fish. So we can also tell from the lithostratigraphy that these rocks are different to these ones, but the biostratigraphy, the fossils are telling us that we have a difference as well. So this is very useful then if we go over and we've got another outcrop, maybe this is in a different valley, it's a couple of kilometers away, and we have similar rock types, but we wouldn't really be able to join the dots just based on the lithostratigraphy. We wouldn't be able to say, oh yes, this unit here is this one, or is it that one? We wouldn't be able to tell how they fit together. So what you can do is to look at the paleontology, look at the fossils. And then in this unit here, we have a look at the fossils and see that we actually have the same suite of fossils. And so that you can use that to link this layer with that layer and correlate these two sequences. And then these underlying layers, again, we have a different suite of fossils. We have a trilobite and a different bivalve. And so we have an idea that not only are these older, but this whole sequence would kind of fit in underneath that one. And so this way you can use the different fossils recorded in a sequence to link two different outcrops together and form a relative age, what's older than what. And this is just giving you a little bit more detail about these ammonites. They're quite famous examples used in biostratigraphy. So they are shelled cephalopods, and in the fossil record we find their shells, and they have a very intricate structure on their shells which preserve really beautifully, and they change over time, and we have a very good understanding of how these shells evolved. And they were only found from the Jurassic to the Cretaceous, so from around 200 million years to 65 million years ago. So if you find these fossils, we know that we are within this time frame straight away. And then because we know how they change through time, if you find rocks of an unknown age, you can compare them to how we know these ammonites evolve, and you can work out the rocks of an unknown age. You can kind of date them by identifying the fossil ammonites in them. So this is kind of bringing it all together. Now we've got a couple of examples. So this is just a series of kind of idealized textbook pictures. So we're looking at different time slots, different kind of 3D reconstructions of time slots of a basin. So in the top picture, we have 4 sedimentary layers, A, B, C, D, and these have been deposited underwater in a large basin. And you can see our law of original horizontality, that they are all horizontal, and the law of superposition, that we have the oldest at the bottom and that they're progressively getting younger. Sorry, excuse me. Yes. No, in the end, no.
That are not sedimentary, because I feel like it's sedimentary.
So these principles only really work for sedimentary rocks. Oh, excuse me. So if you have different rocks, say if you have igneous or metamorphic rocks, we have different ways of dating them. So that's the absolute dating techniques we can use. Oh, excuse me. So, now, this is at, oh, I'm not winning today. All right. So, we have our first time where we have our sequence of rocks, and then we have we have another snapshot of a later time, basically, where this whole stack of rocks has been uplifted, and the ocean which they were being deposited into has dried up, and we just have some rivers. And what the rivers are doing is that they are cutting down and eroding strata D, the younger strata. So it's been eroded away. And then in our third time slot, in time 3, the erosion has continued and has basically stripped away the whole of level D, the youngest one. And in the mountains, which have now got quite high because the rivers have been cutting down, making deep valleys, and probably at the very top of those mountains you would find a little bit of strata D left. So erosion has basically just been cutting down. And in time 4 we have subsidence, where the whole stack has been lowered and has kind of sunk back down and has been flooded again, and we have sediments being washed back into this basin, and we're forming strata E, so that another layer has been formed. And this is just forming over strata C. So this is an unconformity where we've had erosion of strata D, and we have, instead of having horizontal bedded strata which flow nicely onto each other, we've got this unconformity where we've got erosion, and you have an eroded surface which will literally be all uneven. And we have layer E, the newest layer, that's forming on top of layer C. And so we've basically lost layer D as well. So if we look at this stack of rocks now, there's a lot of time missing here. So as geologists, we would have to look at this very carefully, and we would notice that here we have these are all nice and horizontal, but here that this contact between them is different, and we have an unconformity. I mean, we came to date these rocks. If we looked at the fossils, if we used relative dating or absolute dating techniques, we would find out that there was a big time gap missing here, and then we could reconstruct what happened. Yes? Yeah, so that's the challenge. That's what geologists have to figure out. So we could do it by, if the rocks changed very suddenly, you would be able to say, hey, there's something going on here. And then you would have to date them. You would have to figure out how old they are, either by using paleontology or absolute dating techniques. So it's basically only by dating them. So it's all very well looking at kind of textbook examples, but then we've got some real-world examples. So the kind of famous examples of beautiful sedimentary sequences, because they are actually quite rare, is from the Grand Canyon in the US. We're going to look at the Fish River Canyon in Namibia, and closer to home, Tapman's Peak Drive in Cape Town, and look at the Table Mountain rocks. So things to look out for is this law of superposition, the law of original horizontality, cross-cutting relationships, and unconformities and disconformities. So this is the Grand Canyon in the US. It's over 400 kilometers long, nearly 2 kilometers deep, which is quite amazing. And it's exposing 2 billion years of Earth's history. And the Colorado River has eroded down and cut this enormous valley over the last 5 or 6 million years. So this is the view from the southern part of the canyon. And you can see these beautiful layers of sedimentary rocks which have been exposed. So geologists all over the world go nuts for this. It's probably the best example. But if we look at a geological map of the Grand Canyon, so this is just a generalized cross-section. And the rocks that I showed you in the photograph, you can see the beautiful sedimentary layers. And there's some known unconformities where you can see major breaks in deposition. And we can tell this because the rock type changes, and so you know that this is a different environment that they formed in. And then if you start at the very bottom of the valley, we have some schists and some granites, so some igneous rocks, and then which are the oldest, and then lying on top of them is an older sequence of sedimentary rocks that would have originally been deposited horizontally, but have been tilted. And you can see today all the bedding has been tilted over, so we know that those have been deformed. And then there was a period of erosion where they've been eroded off. So we've got lots of processes happening here. We have their original deposition, then their deformation, and then they've been eroded. So we're looking at a lot of time and a lot of different processes. And then the younger sediments have been deposited on top. So that's kind of how geologists read this rock record exposed in the Grand Canyon. And this is just a photograph showing you what it looks like in the field. So this is called an angular unconformity. So you can see here we've got these rocks. There's a person for scale. And you can see that the bedding planes, these are really at an angle. And they've been eroded off, and you've got the younger sediments depositing on top. So this is what it actually looks like in the field. So an example closer to home is the Fish River Canyon in Namibia, and this is a satellite image looking at the Fish River Canyon. And yeah, this canyon is around 160 kilometers long. It's only 500 meters deep, so it's a much smaller scale. And it's exposing around 600 million years of geology. And again, this is the photo just looking down into the canyon and across. And you can see already that we have a different rock type here exposed in the bottom of the valley. And then on top of that, we have the beautiful sedimentary sequence. So this is looking in more detail at what's happening here. So underneath the base of the sequence, we have a gneiss, which is a deformed granite, which is a massive igneous rock. Then we have an unconformity, where this is an igneous rock that's been eroded and cut off, and then on top of this we have the beautiful, and we have some sandstones, and then another unconformity and some limestones deposited on top of that. Yes.
This is one.
No, it's just an example. I just wanted to show you real rocks in the world and what it looks like, and these are the best examples in the world. It's just to give you, rather than kind of idealized textbook pictures, just what you would actually see in reality. And this is just another photograph of looking at this angular unconformity, where you have the gneisses, so these massive igneous rocks at the base of the sequence, and then they've been cut through. We've got these dikes cutting through the gneiss even. So this is where an igneous rock has been cut through by a younger intrusive rock. So you can begin to build up, if you had to put these in time order, what was the oldest and what was the youngest. You have your igneous rock forming, then it gets cut through, and then all of those have been eroded, and then you've got sedimentary rocks forming on top. And finally, we'll just look at Chapman's Peak. So this is looking at the Cape Peninsula, and Chapman's Peak Drive is actually on a major geological contact. So this is the road, runs along here, and these are the Cape granites, and above them is the Table Mountain sandstones. So you can impress your friends with your new geological knowledge. And if we zoom in onto that, so as I said, the road actually follows this major unconformity between the peninsular granites, and here's the granite. This photo is taken on the road, and here's the granite, and then directly above it is the Table Mountain sandstone. And we know from studying this granite that it's 540 million years old, and it was intruded at about 2 kilobars of pressure. So this means that the granite formed and solidified around 6 kilometers below the surface of the Earth. But the fact that today it's sitting at the surface means that there's been around 6 kilometers of material that's been eroded and cut away to expose this granite at the surface. It was probably also uplifted. There's 2 processes going on here. So we have this granite sitting at surface, and there's an erosive contact. So the granite has been eroded, and then we have the sandstone sitting on top of it. So this is just a local example of an unconformity and how we can see the stratigraphy. And then there's another, within the Table Mountain group, so these are the rocks that actually literally make up Table Mountain. And the lower group of rocks are called the Malmesbury, and then we have the Table Mountain group on top of that. And here in the Malmesbury group, the rocks aren't that different, but if you can see, it's not the best photo, but the bedding is actually vertical. So this answers your question, where these rocks, although they were originally deposited horizontally, they've been completely tipped over. So today they are like this, and then the Table Mountain group is on top. So we have an unconformity here, marking the boundary between these 2 units. And I guess as engineers, this is important to take note, because depending on the orientation of the bedding, these rocks will respond and behave differently. All right, so just to wrap up what we've looked at today, we've looked at dating rocks relative to each other. We've got various principles where we can work out the relative age of a sequence. What's the oldest? What's the youngest? What happened first? What happened then? What happened last? And the key concepts that underlie this were defined in the 1600s by Steno, and the law of superposition, original horizontality, and cross-cutting relationships. And another powerful tool to work out how old rocks are relative to each other is using paleontology, the fossils preserved inside them. And we looked at that sort of textbook example, and then famous examples, the Grand Canyon. We also looked at the Fish River Canyon and the Table Mountain sandstones. So next lecture on Tuesday, we're going to look at absolute dating methods, which will be dating other types of rocks, igneous rocks, metamorphic rocks, and sometimes sedimentary rocks as well. So any questions? All right, thanks guys, I'll see you next week.